back to Philosophy Friday. We are going deep today, folks. Really deep.
Yeah, strap in.
Today's deep dive, we're tackling sexuality and power in Western society. How have those in power, thought about it, tried to control it, and how has that view changed over time?
Right. And I think even before we crack open these sources, philosophy, history, even some psychoanalysis, we're going to find it's way more complex than just saying, oh, modern society represses sexuality.
Yeah, I was already thinking that, just looking at the reading list, like, there's got to be more to the story.
There is. One thing that jumps out right from the start, Western thought is kind of obsessed with finding the truth about sex. This constant need to analyze, categorize, and ultimately control this thing that's so personal, so complex, desire.
Right? It's like we're trying to put it under a microscope.
Exactly. One source uses this wild analogy, a magic ring from an 18th century story. When you turn the ring, boom, people spill their deepest sexual secrets.
So what's the ring in our society?
Confession. Therapy. Every time there's a sex scandal in the news, everyone's glued to it. Right. It's not just one thing, but this whole web of forces that makes us feel like we have to explain our sexuality, justify it.
You have to think about that ring analogy.
Yeah.
Okay, so we were saying it's more than just repression.
Way more. One source tears into this thing called the juridico-discursive model of power. Like, power only works through laws, through saying no.
Okay, but that doesn't seem, I don't know, it's not subtle enough, right? How power actually works.
Exactly. These sources suggest that modern society doesn't just repress sex, it builds these elaborate technologies to manage it, to define what it even is.
So not like actual gadgets, right?
No. Think systems of knowledge, categories we use to think about sex, even everyday practices, all working together to shape how we understand, experience our own desires.
Instead of just, locking desire up, it's more like building a very specific playground for it with its own set of rules.
A perfect analogy. And how do those rules get made? Well, one striking example is how women's bodies, specifically around sexuality, got medicalized.
Oh yeah, like hysteria. I remember reading about that.
Right. Any behavior that was considered unfeminine could be a symptom. Having strong opinions, hysteria, expressing sexual desire that wasn't, the right kind. Hysteria.
So a woman could basically be labeled as mentally ill just for expressing her needs or desires.
It was a way to make women's sexuality this pathological thing, something to be treated, often through really brutal interventions. And the message was clear. Women's bodies were inherently unstable, prone to disorder, and in need of male control.
Wow. Talk about power and knowledge working together and not in a good way.
And it's not just women. Another technology is this focus on children's sexuality. Think about it. When did you first become aware of sex as this problematic thing, something to be anxious about?
Oh, I don't know. Probably those super awkward sex ed classes in school. They always talked about it like it was forbidden.
That's the point. They scrutinize kids' behavior, especially anything around masturbation, creating this sense of shame and anxiety.
Right. So even if kids aren't actually doing anything, the anxiety's already there, shaping how they'll view sex later.
And this anxiety wasn't random. There was this whole war on onanism against masturbation, fueled by medical and moral panic. It was seen as, draining your energy, weakening you, even making you mentally ill.
They were that worried about people pleasuring themselves alone.
Oh, yeah. Shows how deep this need to control every aspect of sexuality went, even the most private stuff. Okay, so we've got this focus on women, on kids. What other technologies did these sources uncover?
Right, lay it on us.
They found 4 major strategies they call strategic unities. We've hit 2. The historization of women's bodies and this turning of children's sex into this problem to be solved, pedagogization.
So basically, instead of letting kids be kids, they make it into something that needs to be, educated and disciplined out of them.
You got it. The other 2 strategic unities are the socialization of procreative behavior and the psychiatrization of perverse pleasure.
Okay, break those down for us. Socialization of procreative behavior. That sounds like controlling who has babies, when, and under what circumstances.
Spot on. It's making sure sex serves the needs of the state, the economy. Think who benefits from limiting access to contraception. Who benefits from pushing marriage as the only way to have kids?
Makes you think. A lot of what we see is natural about family reproduction isn't so natural after all.
Right. And then we have the psychiatrization of perverse pleasure. Basically, they decided certain sexualities were perverse and needed medical psychological intervention.
So this is where homosexuality, fetishism become medical diagnoses. They're not just different ways of experiencing pleasure, they're pathologies to be cured.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about controlling individuals, it was about reinforcing social norms, drawing a line between normal and abnormal.
And those lines have real consequences, right? How people are treated, what laws get passed.
Absolutely. And it all ties back to that quest for the truth of sex and how that quest is often used to justify control and exclusion.
Okay, lots to unpack there. We've got these 4 strategic unities, ways to control sexuality that are like woven into Western society. But before we go deeper into each one, there's this other wild idea from the sources.
Hit me with it.
Okay, so get this. Sexuality, how we understand it today, it's inherently bourgeois.
Interesting. You know, I can actually see that. Like, the bourgeoisie, they use sexuality to define themselves, set themselves apart from the aristocracy.
Instead of the aristocracy's blue blood lineage, it's all about healthy bodies, the nuclear family, as a sign of stability.
Right. And if something as personal as sexuality is shaped by class, what else is?
Another deep dive for another day. Maybe, but for now, I think we've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? These technologies of sex, the strategic unities, and now this idea that sexuality itself is this, I don't know, bourgeois invention.
My head's spinning. And we've barely scratched the surface.
Right. Stay tuned, folks, because in part 2, we'll get into those 4 strategic unities, how they played out in history. We'll also dive deeper into bourgeois sexuality and what it means for how we understand our own desires and identities.
Don't miss it. Okay, so we've laid some groundwork. Sexuality, it's not just some biological drive, it's a social construct too, a product of how power works and systems of knowledge.
Right. And we've been looking at it through the super narrow lens of repression, but now these sources are like, boom, here's this whole other dimension, all about power and how sexuality is constructed.
Right. And to describe these power systems, one source uses this term strategic unities.
Strategic unities. Sounds kind of ominous. What's that about?
Basically, it's saying there are these, I don't know, like master plans, strategies that determine how power gets used when it comes to sex. The sources identify 4 of them. We talked about them before: the historization of women's bodies, the pedagogization of children's sex, the socialization of procreative behavior, and the psychiatrization of perverse pleasure. But thinking about them as strategic unities helps us see the bigger picture.
Yeah, before it was just examples. Now I want to know, like, what's the logic connecting them all?
Good point. I think strategic unities shows that this isn't random, it's intentional. There's the deliberate effort to control, to shape sexuality according to specific goals. It's not just repression, it's like a campaign.
I'm starting to get it. Okay, so the first one, historization of women's bodies. How's that fit into this bigger picture of control?
Okay, think about it. It's all about medicalizing, making women's sexuality seem pathological, turning totally natural stuff, bodily functions, emotions, into symptoms that need a doctor's intervention.
Yeah, periods were seen as weakness, pregnancy was dangerous, any desire outside marriage meant you were mentally unstable.
Exactly. And this medicalization, it served a purpose, you know? Men could control women's reproduction, traditional gender roles were reinforced, and any female sexuality that threatened things, well, it was suppressed, all in the name of health.
So basically, they make women's bodies seem inherently problematic, and that justifies a whole system of control. Like, it's all for your own good, right?
Precisely. And it's not just individual doctors, it's society-wide laws, religious beliefs, culture, even just how people interact every day. It all reinforces it.
Okay, so that's the historization of women's bodies as a strategic unity. Now, what about the second one? The pedagogization of children's sex.
So if historization was about medicalizing female sexuality, this one is about problematizing and controlling sexuality in kids from a young age. You instill anxiety, shame around natural impulses, turning normal exploration into something dangerous, deviant.
And this ties into that war on onanism, the anti-masturbation stuff.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's not just about masturbation, though. It's about controlling all forms of childhood sexuality, molding it to fit a very specific idea of what's right. Think about your own childhood. What messages did you get about sex?
God, so many unspoken rules. Don't touch yourself, don't talk about it, don't even think about it. It was all hush-hush, shrouded in shame.
That's exactly what this strategic unity is about. Shaping those desires before they fully form. Instilling this way of thinking about sex that'll stay with you as an adult.
It's crazy how these subtle forms of control can have such a huge impact. You know, it's not a physical cage, but it's a cage nonetheless.
It is, and it's a cage built with bars of knowledge and power, and those bars are reinforced by what society expects of you.
Okay, we've got historization of women's bodies, pedagogization of children's sex. What about that third strategic unity, the socialization of procreative behavior?
All right, so this one. It's about controlling reproduction, making sure sex serves the needs of the state, the economy, keeping things in order. It's all about channeling sexual energy into what's socially acceptable and economically productive.
Okay, so like tax breaks if you have a bunch of kids, or the opposite, penalties if you have too many, or making it hard to get contraception or an abortion.
Bingo. And it's not just about controlling how many people there are, it's about defining what counts as a legitimate family.
Meaning marriage is the only acceptable context for sex and having kids. Anything else is a threat to society.
Exactly. And it's often religion, cultural norms, even laws that reinforce it all. Think about sodomy laws or how adultery was a crime, especially for women.
It's kind of wild how much work goes into making this one very specific path for sexual expression, and it's a path that benefits those in power.
It does make you think. And it reminds us that these strategic unities aren't just abstract ideas, they affect how we live our lives, how we experience sexuality.
That's a good point. Okay, that brings us to the last one, psychiatrization of perverse pleasure.
So here, certain types of sexuality are labeled as perverse, needing medical and psychological intervention. It's the rise of psychiatry as this force that defines and controls how we behave sexually.
So that's where homosexuality, fetishism, they become diagnoses, right? Not just different ways of experiencing pleasure, but something to be cured.
You got it. This medicalization, it was tied to the idea that the sexual instinct is this powerful, dangerous force that needs to be managed, channeled in the right direction.
So instead of just saying no to certain sexualities, they build a whole system of knowledge around them and then use that to justify intervening, controlling people. It's like to control something, first you got to define it, categorize it, put it in a box.
You're absolutely right. And this system of knowledge wasn't just for psychiatrists. It spread to law enforcement, education, social work, all these institutions that shape our lives.
It's amazing how all these different things, morality, medicine, law, social norms, come together to control sexuality.
It's complex, but it didn't just appear out of thin air. These strategic unities came about in specific historical and cultural situations, shaped by anxieties, power struggles of the time.
Right. Okay, so we've gone over these four strategic unities. Historization of women's bodies, pedagogization of children's sex, socialization of procreative behavior, and psychiatrization of perverse pleasure. Heavy stuff. It shows how deeply ingrained these systems of control are in our society.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in, but think about it. If these strategic unities have been so effective in shaping us, our desires, our behaviors, what does that mean for how much agency we actually have? For our freedom to explore, to express ourselves?
Oh, that's a huge question. Maybe we all need a minute to let this sink in. What do you think, listeners? Think about your own experiences, what you've been told about sex, and how these strategic unities might have shaped how you think about sexuality.
Take a moment to process it. It's important to connect these ideas to our own lives.
Okay, so we've spent the last two parts of Philosophy Friday really digging into these strategic unities, how power shapes how we think about sexuality in the West. It's a lot, I know, but I hope you've had some time to process it all.
Definitely a lot to digest. But the point isn't to freak out, it's to become more aware of these forces that are shaping our lives, even in the most personal areas like our sexuality.
Knowledge is power, right? And speaking of power, I keep wondering why this need to control sexuality in the first place? What is it about pleasure that seems so threatening?
The big question, right? And these sources give us some clues. One thing they keep pointing to is that sexuality is inherently social. It's not just about what I desire. It's about relationships, power between people, and how all that plays out in society.
So it's not just controlling bodies, it's about controlling those social structures, the hierarchies.
Exactly. Think about marriage. It's not just, oh, we're in love. It's a legal contract, an economic thing, a foundation of how society is structured. And historically, it's been the main way to control sexuality, who gets to sleep with who, when, why.
Even today, even with all the changes, marriage still has so much weight. Symbolically, legally.
Yeah.
It's like the model for how relationships should be, and anything different is, well, deviant.
And that brings us back to that idea of the truth of sex. Whoever gets to define that truth, they get to control it. Draw the lines between what's normal, what's not, what's allowed, what's not.
It makes you wonder, is there even such a thing as the truth about something like sexuality? I mean, it's so complex, so different for everyone.
Right. These sources suggest that this whole idea of a single truth is the problem. It doesn't allow for how diverse human experience really is. Sexuality isn't just one thing, it's this huge range of desires, identities, ways people express themselves.
So instead of trying to force everyone into the same mold, maybe we should be, celebrating that diversity, accepting that there are lots of truths about sexuality.
Now, that's a liberating thought. And to get there, we have to question those rigid categories we've been given, the strategic unities we've been talking about.
Yeah. What if instead of normal, abnormal, straight, gay, vanilla, kinky? What if we accepted that human desire is fluid, complex?
That would be a huge shift in how we think, wouldn't it? Letting go of the old ways of seeing things and embracing something more nuanced, inclusive.
A big challenge. But I think it's worth it. In the end, don't we want a world where everyone feels free to explore their desires, express themselves, without being judged or punished?
Absolutely. That makes me think about the ethics of it all. If power has such a big influence on sexuality, what responsibility do we have to challenge those power dynamics, to make the world more just, more fair?
That's a really good question. It reminds us that these conversations about sex and power, they're not just theoretical, they're about real people.
Exactly. It's about recognizing how much harm those systems of control have caused, and working to make a world where everyone has the right to experience pleasure, intimacy on their own terms.
So what can we do? How do we even begin to change systems that are so ingrained?
Awareness is a good first step. Recognizing how these technologies of sex have shaped our own thoughts, our behaviors, our relationships. Once you see how it works, you can start to change it.
And that means creating spaces where people can talk openly and honestly about sex,
Right.
where they feel safe to share, to explore, to challenge the norms that don't work anymore.
Absolutely. Building a culture of consent, where pleasure isn't something to fear or be ashamed of, but something to celebrate, enjoy, always with respect, mutual agreement, of course.
So it's not just changing laws, it's changing how we think, how we feel. Creating a world where people are empowered to define their own sexuality, pursue their own pleasure without fear.
That's the dream, isn't it? Sexuality is a source of joy, connection, freedom, not shame or oppression.
I love that. Well, I think that about wraps up our deep dive into sexuality and power.
It's been a journey, and big thanks to you, our amazing host, for guiding us through such complex terrain with so much grace and insight.
And a huge thank you to you, our expert, for sharing your knowledge and shedding light on all these hidden parts of how power works.
And of course, thank you to our listeners for coming along on this intellectual adventure with us. We hope this deep dive has given you new insights, some thought-provoking questions, and maybe even a sense of hope. The search for understanding never ends, and the pursuit of pleasure ethically, of course, is something we all deserve. So until next time, keep those critical thinking caps on, challenge the status quo, and keep on diving deep.